In today's video, we're going to be breaking down the differences between doing a high-fat carnivore diet and a high-protein carnivore diet. This video is going to be one of my more controversial videos because my opinion on this actually differs slightly from many others in the carnivore community. And I think a lot of people are having their carnivore results held back due to some slightly misguided advice. So let's go through the role of each of these things. When we consume protein, it is broken down into amino acids, which essentially act as the building block for everything in our body. They're required for the creation of cells, repairing our muscle tissues. Protein is an incredibly essential nutrient. Excess protein not used for these functions can sometimes be converted into glucose through a process known as gluconeogenesis. And this right here is why a lot of people who have a very high protein carnivore diet aren't actually in ketosis. Some often overlooked functions of protein include the creation of hormones. Hormones like insulin and growth hormone are actually made from protein. Protein is also a very important aspect of satiety, or feeling full. There is a famous hypothesis called the protein leverage hypothesis, which essentially states that the reason humans are hungry is because we haven't consumed enough protein, and that as soon as we hit the required amount of protein we need, we will no longer be hungry. And whilst I don't 100% agree with this, because I think our satiety is much more complex than that, and it involves how much of each individual nutrient have we consumed, I still think that the protein leverage hypothesis does hold some weight. So as we can see, we need protein, we need a lot of it, and that is another reason why the carnivore diet is so effective, because by default, just by eating a lot of meat, we consume a lot of protein. Now we're going to look at the other essential nutrient, fat. Notice how I said other. Carbohydrates are the only macronutrient that humans do not need. When we consume fats, they're broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. Fats themselves do not directly raise our blood sugar levels, which is another key component of consuming fats. If we were to consume a steak that was very lean and only had protein, we would have more of a blood sugar spike than if we consumed a fatty steak. Like protein, we need fats to create our cells and to create our hormones. They are also required for the absorption of many nutrients. Certain nutrients like vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin K are fat-soluble nutrients, meaning for them to be absorbed, they must be consumed at the same time as fats. Fats are incredibly important for satiety. Many people think that by eating fat, it will make them fat, when in reality there's this interesting paradox that if we don't consume enough fat, we're never going to feel full, which will cause us to eat more and then we'll get fat. So by looking at just some of the functions of each of these nutrients, we can come to a pretty concrete conclusion that we need to consume both of them and a substantial amount of them in that. Now, what would happen if you had a very high protein diet with not much fat? Let's look at that. For starters, you would feel terrible. You'd have virtually no energy. Like I talked about, we need these fats to create many of our essential hormones, as well as the fact that, well, fat is obviously the best source of energy. Now, if you are super overweight, you can kind of get away with this to some degree, because your body will tap into its own body fat for some of the things it needs. However, what you will find is that over time, as you start to lose weight and get leaner and leaner, is that when you don't eat a lot of fat, you just start to feel terrible. I personally noticed this. When I started carnivore, I wasn't consuming that much fat. I was peak bulk, which basically means I was fat. And so even though the majority of the meat I was eating was pretty lean, I didn't seem to notice too many issues. However, as I started getting leaner and leaner and had less body fat to draw from, if I went 1 or 2 days of only eating leaner cuts of meat, I'd get this weird sensation. I can't really describe it, but it was just like my head kind of felt tight almost, and intuitively I could just tell it was my body asking for more fat. I've also heard of other people experiencing the sensation. Let me know down below if you have. Now, what would happen if you did the complete opposite? You had lots of fat and very little protein. Well, for starters, I can't imagine your stomach would be doing too well. For fat to be absorbed, it requires something called bile, and our body can only produce so much bile. So if you're eating an absurd amount of fat and your bile hasn't upregulated that high, what's going to happen? Well, you can't break the fat down, it's going to end up in your stools and you're going to have loose stools. And then the other problem you're going to have is that you're not repairing your muscle tissues, and therefore you're not going to have any muscle mass, which will end up in you looking like the typical vegan. And you're also going to be incredibly hungry, like we talked about with the protein leverage hypothesis. So, now you know what to do. You know, not going to have too much protein and not enough fat, and I'm not going to have too much fat and not enough protein. But what is the ideal amount? Well, for sedentary individuals, you want to consume around 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. This amount right here is where you'll be satiated and it will give your body more than enough protein to carry out its necessary functions. And then for active individuals, you want 1 to 1.5 grams of protein per pound of body weight. And then after you've hit that amount, you want to get the rest of your energy from fats. I can't give an exact number because people just have very different lifestyles. I think a good place to start though is a 1-to-1 ratio. But when I say this, please remember that in 100 grams of lean muscle meat, there is 20 grams of protein. But in 100 grams of fat, there is 100 grams of fat. A lot of people make the mistake when you say a 1-to-1 ratio, and they assume from this that 1 pound of muscle meat means they need to eat 1 pound of fat. If you do that, believe me, you're going to spend your entire life in the bathroom. Do not do that. When I say a 1-to-1 ratio, it means 1 kilogram of muscle meat and 200 grams of fat. This right there will result in you getting 200 grams of protein and 200 grams of fat. Now, I said at the start of this video I have a controversial take on this topic, and that take is that for many individuals, I think having a super high fat carnivore diet may actually be detrimental. There is this notion amongst the carnivore community that you can eat unlimited amounts of energy and be absolutely ripped, which I just do not fundamentally believe to be true. And I've seen Sean Baker talk about this topic, who has the exact same perspective as me. I've gained weight on carnivore when bulking up, eating only steak and eggs. Sean Baker's gained weight on carnivore, eating only steak. Mark Bell's gained weight on carnivore, eating only steak. Now, for the three of us, we were intentionally eating a lot of steak in order to bulk up and gain some muscle mass. But these examples right here prove you can only eat steak and gain weight. A lot of people say that because you're not spiking your insulin, your body can't store fat. However, like I talked about at the start, when we consume protein, our insulin spikes at least to some degree, which means that we can store it as fat. We can also think about this from a purely logical standpoint. For hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, humans exclusively ate meat. Now, if we couldn't store any of this meat as fat because our insulin allegedly isn't being spiked, how are we still around? We would have all died of starvation. If this was true, why isn't every single person on the carnivore diet 7% body fat whilst eating 10 meals per day? A very high fat carnivore diet is great for people whose sole goal is to heal, as the super high amounts of fat mean they're going to constantly be in ketosis, which is incredibly advantageous for a lot of conditions. However, if your goal is to look absolutely ripped, like you're from a movie, you walk down the beach and everyone's staring at you, I do honestly believe you need to lower the fat at least to some degree. You definitely don't want to go too lean, as we talked about earlier, and even by having a super high fat approach, you can still look great. But if we're going for that movie star look, we do need to drop the fats ever so slightly. Now, this video so far has contained lots of information that is contrary to other information in this video, and I do apologize if you're watching this video right now and you're pretty confused. Let me give you a few actionable steps. I think a 1-to-1 ratio, like I talked about earlier, is a good place to start. If you want to get lean, maybe drop the fats ever so slightly. And if you're trying to heal some condition, maybe consume more fats than this 1-to-1 ratio. If you're having stomach issues, you've got the runs, drop the fat. If you're constipated and don't feel amazing, up the fat. How much fat you need depends person to person. Make sure you hit the protein amount that we talked about earlier, which is 1 gram per pound of body weight, and then have as much fat as what feels right to you. Thank you guys very much for watching. I hope I didn't make this too confusing, but it's a very nuanced topic. Oh yeah, and subscribe if you want to see more of my videos.